Welcome to 10th or Tuesday, episode 6. My name is Michael Boldin here at the 10th Amendment Center, along with
Michael Maharrey, also with the 10th Amendment Center.
Awesome. So we missed last week. I apologize to those of you who may have been waiting for us to do our living, breathing version of every. I got that from Mike, but unfortunately we weren't able to do it last week. Hopefully we'll get moving with it every or almost every Tuesday going forward here. But Mike, I wanted to talk about a couple of recent reports that we've had over on the 10th blog at blog.10thamendmentcenter.com. One, for example, in your home state there in Kentucky, there's a bill pre-filed for 2017 that takes a first step against the Federal Reserve monopoly on money by encouraging gold and silver use as tender, as money, the way it should be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's basically it's a pretty simple, and sometimes simple is good. All it does is remove the state sales tax in Kentucky from the purchase of gold or silver bullion. And what this does, in effect, is it opens the door for people to utilize gold and silver actually as money in transactions. As it is now, you're going to get taxed on this, on any exchange of gold and silver. The sales tax in Kentucky is 7%. So this just opens the door. It makes it easier to obtain gold and silver. It incentivizes people to buy gold and silver, and this is the number one step. And I've been talking to some folks over at the Sound Money Institute. They say that this is absolutely the first thing that has to happen in every state. Now, a lot of states don't have sales tax on gold and silver, but everyone that does, the first step is to get rid of that sales tax. So it's a great first step.
Yeah, it's a roadblock. It's a roadblock in the way of. It's a roadblock
Right.
in the way of being able to use gold and silver as currency the way it should be, because people are going to say, well, if I have to pay an extra 10% or 5% or whatever it may be, that's going to discourage their use. So that's BR 156 in Kentucky. When does the legislative session get started there?
I believe it's the second week in January, but I'm not completely sure. It's usually the second week. We'll say that, and if it's not, it's somewhere close. Yeah, early January, and then it runs through about March or April.
Another item that we covered recently on the blog was this local ordinance in, I believe, what's the county? There's a county in Oregon that said that they're not going to expend any money or resources towards the enforcement of any new gun control measures, whether it's state or federal. What was that located again, Mike?
You know what? I don't remember off the top of my head what the name of that county was. And,
okay.
I should remember that.
Can you give us a little insight on what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, what they're doing is they passed an ordinance. They passed it 3-2, and Gold Beach is the city, and the county is. Hold on a second. We have internet, so we can look up these things. But basically, what they've done is they've said that our city. And basically, it's the county sheriff is what we're talking about here. The county sheriff is not going to, or they're not going to fund any enforcement of any type of gun control that's passed in the future. So it doesn't affect anything that's on the books now, but anything that they pass at the state level or at the federal level, the city council is simply not going to fund any local enforcement of that. So again, we're talking about another first step. This is Curry County in Oregon. And this is another great first step. You know, if you get some kind of executive order at the federal level or some kind of horrible gun control at the state level, the city or in the county are simply not going to enforce it. And this is the local application of the anti-commandeering doctrine, which James Madison said would create obstructions, and that's exactly what they're trying to do there in Curry County. So, great step, and we love seeing these things at the local level because they tend to percolate up. Other counties are going to look at this and say, well, we can do this too, and if enough counties do it, then the state's going to be much more reluctant to pass gun control and may even take steps of its own to limit it.
Well, what's, I think, most important to note on these things is that any gun control measure, especially from Washington, D.C., cannot be enforced without the assistance of local government agents, whether it's police or sheriff or whatever it may be, because they don't have the resources to pull it off. And that's what we've highlighted many times on our website, a statement from Judge Andrew Napolitano talking about how doing so, just simply withdrawing from the enforcement of a new federal gun control measure, would make it, as Napolitano put it, nearly impossible to enforce. And that's a very powerful first step to be taken. It can happen on a local level, and for those people in states like Oregon or here in California or elsewhere where you're really not going to see that happen on a state level, this is something concrete that you can do right now. And if you're thinking forward to what might be the next Supreme Court nominee, this is a real important strategy to start looking inward on how to deal with gun control before it even gets off the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. I looked it up not long ago, and there's something in the neighborhood of 400 ATF enforcement agents. So you figure that's less than 10 per state if you divide it out. So they absolutely depend heavily on state and local law enforcement to enforce these types of things.
In general, when they do an enforcement action, what happens is you have one or two lead ATF agents on the ground, and then you have a sheriff or local police dealing with traffic control, oftentimes handling the delivery of the warrant, knocking on the door, securing the perimeter, for example. So a lot of the essential parts of a raid or an enforcement measure on gun control is handled by the local law enforcement officers. So with a very small number of ATF agents, they're just not going to get the job done. So this is really strong. It's also been done in a number of localities. Elsewhere, for example, reported a few years ago over in Kansas that there's a few areas that have done this type of thing. And I think it really should spread. We've seen this happen. And Mike, we talked in one of the last recent episodes about the same type of response to HUD, this local action where they're just saying, hey, we're not gonna take your money, so we're not going to implement your requirements or your regulations.
Right. And it's the same thing we see it with the marijuana too. We're starting to see more and more local municipalities pass decriminalization measures on marijuana, and where even though there may be state laws or federal laws, local police are just going to write a ticket and let the people it's all of these steps work together, and each piece of the puzzle makes it increasingly difficult. It's almost like pulling pieces out of the puzzle. You've got this enforcement tapestry that the federal government wants to create, and each one of these actions pulls out a piece of the puzzle. And you lose enough piece, the puzzle becomes absolutely useless. You can't see what the picture is anymore. So I love this type of local action, and I think if more people would get involved at the local level, we could see these types of things happen, because I think local representatives are a lot more responsive than state, and in state are a lot more responsive than the federal people. So,
speaking of strategy, you wrote a blog piece talking about ballot measures, and the way I was actually seeing this was that the right has kind of dropped the ball on this, because if you look at the ballot measures that are on the ballot, I guess that would be the right term. They're on the ballot here, November 8th. Almost all of them are issues from the left. Certainly there are 8 or 9 states that are looking at some form of marijuana legalization that rejects an unconstitutional federal prohibition on a plant. But there are other things like gun control measures, minimum wage. There's a single-payer health care issue on the ballot in Colorado. And whether or not these win or lose, we're not necessarily going to take one position or the other. I think most of them are, in general, are bad. The ones rejecting federal power are good across the board. But I've noticed that in recent years, there have been very few ballot measures coming from the right. In fact, I don't know really of any that have been on the ballot in a long time, if ever, regarding, for example, legalizing firearms that the federal government prohibits, like what the left has done so successfully with the plant known as marijuana. You took an interesting perspective on this as well, maybe a little bit different than the way I was seeing it, Mike, talking about how it's mostly the group that's out of power, maybe in the House, for example, in Congress, that tends to use this type of approach.
Yeah, I found it interesting as I was digging into the reporting on this and the article specifically that I was reading, because I was kind of thinking the same thing as you initially. The left is utilizing this tool, the right isn't. But the article pointed out that back in the 90s, it was the right putting ballot initiatives out. And so I started thinking, well, it does make sense because you realize, well, I can't get something done in my state legislature. What else am I going to do? So the out of power folks are utilizing these ballot measures, and the article pointed out the overwhelming Republican control. I think there's 31 state governments that are completely
30.
under 30.
There's
30.
30 states right now.
So you look at that, but for us as people who want to limit federal power, we even those 30 states that are Republican controlled, we still face huge barriers. So why not use this ballot initiative avenue more? Even in we've seen this in states like Tennessee that are heavily Republican. It's still difficult to get them to actually limit federal power. So maybe we need to look.
There's only a certain number of states, obviously, that you can actually use initiative and referendum. Right. For example, like Arizona, here in California,
Missouri, I think is one.
I'm not sure if it's citizen initiated in Missouri. It might be. I know that they had trouble getting a medical marijuana bill on the ballot approved by the Supreme Court of the state there. So maybe it is citizen initiated there. It's important to recognize when you have an opportunity to do it. Most of the time, the state legislature isn't going to be on your side, like you said, Mike. So with 30 Republican-controlled state houses and state senates at the same time for 4+ years, you'd think all this talk about how Obama was the worst thing the country has ever experienced, you would have seen all kinds of action by Republican-controlled state legislatures. But in general, they've been interested more in keeping the status quo. Maybe a lot of those legislators want to go up to Washington, D.C.
Well, yeah, we see that a lot. It's interesting to me, too, you start looking at these ballot measures and these state legislators, and I completely lost train of thought of what I was going to say.
Well, I guess that's going to be the end of the road for us today. Stay tuned for more exciting, we call them brain farts, right?
Yeah.
Next week, Tuesday, and every Tuesday, hopefully, here at the 10th Amendment Center. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you again soon.